The government has announced $2.5 billion to be spent on beds for prisoners, for want of a less simple explanation. A new prison to be built and prisons to be upgraded to house more prisoners. It's an interesting situation because we ask, another 1,800 prisoners going to prison. Why is that? What are the situations around that? Bill English spoke yesterday, I believe it was, in the last couple of days, depending on when you see this, of why this was happening, and specifically getting asked around tax cuts, because we're being promised by the national government tax cuts, but now people are saying if $2.5 billion is going to be spent, what happens to our tax cuts? And this is what he had to say about that. I wouldn't want to judge that because it's a bit early, but certainly spending this kind of money on prison capacity is going to reduce other options. This is something that has to be done. We certainly prefer to be in a position where this wasn't happening. So increasing beds in prisons, and obviously, as you'll appreciate, different parts of the political spectrum have different positions on this. Andrew Little said this, quote, "When you take police off the beat and when you close down community police stations, you remove the deterrent effect." As we go on, Kelvin Davis has said, Bill English was the person that said prisons were a fiscal and moral failure, and he was dead right. Wouldn't you prefer to spend $1 billion on stopping people getting into prisons in the first place rather than locking them up? Now, what Kelvin Davis is talking about is actually Bill English in 2011 and what was said. And we have that quote for you. This is from 2011. This is Bill English. "Prisons are a fiscal and moral failure, and building more of them on a large scale is something I don't think any New Zealander wants to see. They want a safer community and they want protection from the worst element of criminal behaviour, but they don't want to be a prison colony. It's the fastest rising cost in government in the last decade, and my view is we shouldn't build any more of them." So that was Bill English, and I guess you'd say national, in 2011. But how the times have changed. We are building not just more of them, but we are building a brand new facility as well. It's a conversation that's been ongoing. And in 2011, a lot of people who don't support the incarceration system as we run it were hopeful of Bill English's comments. Perhaps there'd be a new way to look at this. And it's the oversimplistic idea of, fence at the top of the cliff, ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. You sort of need both. Building new prisons is seen by many as just the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. It's looking after the problem once it's got to its worst case scenario, as opposed to addressing the issue earlier on and perhaps preventing that person from going off the cliff. Now, that on top of this potentially being a PPP, a public-private partnership, which I believe Judith Collins has spoken about in the last 24 hours, raises concerns as well about running prisons for profit. Running prisons for profit obviously has a concern for many people, because if profit is the motivation, then other things can drop off, like welfare of the prisoners, like security, like staffing numbers. And it's a concern that perhaps the right side of politics would always like to look at everything being either privatised or public-private partnership. And sometimes things need to just be a service. We don't public-privatise partnership our libraries. It's just a service. And as ridiculous as it sounds, perhaps prisons should just be a service. That being said, I'll give you an anecdotal story. It's a story that's happened to me, so it's firsthand. I was interviewing John Key, gosh, who knows, in the last 7 or 8 years, on radio. It was a Sunday night and we were having a conversation. I had a partner with me on the radio and he was in for the whole hour. During an ad break, he spoke to us very candidly. None of it was said to be off the record, so I feel comfortable sharing it with you. I believe I might have shared it once before in ODT. John Key told us a story of when he went to Paremarema prison, which is a maximum security in the North Island prison. He said to us that speaking to the people involved with the prison, speaking to the guards, the people who know the prisoners and see them there, very clearly 1/3 of those maximum security prisoners should be in those prisons. You should lock the door and you should throw away the key. He then said 1/3 of the prisoners should do their time, pay their penalty and rejoin society. And John Key tells us from his investigation or conversations with the staff at this prison that 1/3 of those prisoners shouldn't be there at all. And the reason that seemed pretty clear, it was for minor offences or perhaps offences like possession of marijuana, drug possession, that sort of thing, possibly shouldn't be there. So a Prime Minister on one hand who tells us in a public setting, there were several of us in the room, that perhaps 1/3 of the prisoners of Paremarema shouldn't be there, now runs a government who's building capacity for 1,800 more prisoners. I have to just say, from my perspective, you've got to ask the question why, And you've got to wonder why this is and why perhaps we haven't got a government looking to put that fence at the top of the cliff rather than being so insistent on the ambulance at the bottom.